African leaders who changed history. What if I told you that some of the most powerful empires in human history weren't in Europe or Asia, but in Africa? That leaders from this continent shaped the course of world history in ways that textbooks often overlook? Today, we're diving deep into the stories of African leaders who didn't just change their nations, they changed the world. From ancient kings who built empires wealthier than medieval Europe, to freedom fighters who inspired global liberation movements, to visionaries who redefined what leadership means in the modern era. I'm talking about rulers who commanded armies of thousands, leaders who stood up to colonial superpowers, and revolutionaries who proved that dignity and freedom are non-negotiable. So buckle up, because by the end of this video, you'll see African history and world history in a whole new light. We're starting with a man so wealthy that his spending habits literally crash economies. I'm talking about Mansa Musa, the 14th century emperor of the Mali Empire. Now, when we think of wealthy historical figures, names like Rockefeller or Carnegie might come to mind. But Mansa Musa? Economists estimate his wealth at around $400 billion in today's money. That makes him potentially the richest person to ever live. But here's what makes Musa truly revolutionary. He didn't just hoard wealth. He understood something that modern leaders are still trying to figure out, that true power comes from education, infrastructure, and cultural influence. In 1324, Mansa Musa decided to make the pilgrimage to Mecca. And when I say he made a pilgrimage, I don't mean he bought a plane ticket and flew economy. No. This man rolled out with a caravan of 60,000 people. 60,000. We're talking soldiers, entertainers, merchants, camels, and officials. And he brought along about 12 tons of gold. When he passed through Cairo, Egypt, he was so generous with his gold, giving it away to the poor, buying souvenirs, paying for everything in sight, that he actually caused massive inflation. The value of gold in Egypt didn't recover for over a decade. But here's what's really important. Mansa Musa put Africa on the map. Literally, after his pilgrimage, Mali appeared on European and Arab maps as a major center of wealth and culture. He brought back architects and scholars from his journey. He transformed Timbuktu into one of the world's great centers of learning, with universities that attracted scholars from across the Islamic world. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu had one of the largest libraries in the world at the time, with hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Students came from as far as Persia to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and law. Mansa Musa proved that African civilizations weren't just equal to their contemporaries. In many ways, they were ahead. His legacy reminds us that Africa has always been a center of innovation, wealth, and learning. Let's jump forward to the 17th century and talk about someone who combined military genius with diplomatic savvy in ways that would make Machiavelli jealous. Meet Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba in what's now Angola. Picture this. It's the 1620s. Portuguese colonizers are aggressively expanding into Central Africa, capturing people for the slave trade, and trying to control the region. Most African kingdoms are struggling to resist. There's this legendary story from 1622. Nzinga went to negotiate with the Portuguese governor. When she arrived, the Portuguese tried to assert dominance. The governor had a chair, but only provided a floor mat for Nzinga. You know what she did? She ordered one of her servants to get on all fours, and she sat on the servant's back during the entire negotiation. She met them at eye level, refused to be diminished, and negotiated a treaty as an equal. For over 30 years, Queen Nzinga fought Portuguese colonization. She formed alliances with rival kingdoms, and even with the Dutch when it served her purposes. She personally led her armies into battle well into her 60s. She used guerrilla warfare tactics, strategic retreats, and diplomacy to keep her people free. She created a safe haven for escaped slaves and for people fleeing Portuguese control. Her kingdom became a symbol of resistance throughout the region. What makes Nzinga so important isn't just that she resisted colonization, it's how she did it. She adapted. She learned Portuguese military tactics and improved on them. She understood that you can't just fight with weapons. You have to fight with strategy, diplomacy, and intelligence. Today, she's remembered as a mother of Angola, a symbol of resistance and female empowerment. Schools, streets, and even Angola's currency honor her legacy. Queen Nzinga proved that African leaders could stand toe-to-toe with European colonial powers and win. Now let's fast forward to the 20th century, to a man who didn't just free his own country. He inspired an entire continent to break free from colonial rule. Kwame Nkrumah, the man who led Ghana to become the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence from European colonization in 1957. To understand why this matters, you need to know that in 1957, nearly all of Africa was still under European control. The idea that African countries could govern themselves was considered radical, even laughable, by many Western powers. Nkrumah didn't just politely ask for independence. He organized. He mobilized. He created a mass movement that made Ghana ungovernable under colonial rule. He was imprisoned by the British colonial government. And you know what happened? His party won the elections while he was still in prison. The British had no choice but to release him and work toward independence. When Ghana gained independence on March 6, 1957, it sent shockwaves across the world. Nkrumah stood before his people and declared, "We have awakened. We will not sleep anymore." But Nkrumah's vision went way beyond Ghana. He was a champion of Pan-Africanism, the idea that all African nations should unite to create economic and political strength. He believed that political independence was meaningless without economic independence. He invested heavily in education, building schools and universities. He built the Akosombo Dam, one of the world's largest hydroelectric projects at the time. He pushed for industrialization and self-sufficiency. Now, Nkrumah wasn't perfect. His later years in power became increasingly authoritarian, and he was eventually overthrown in a coup. But that doesn't diminish his historical impact. Within a decade of Ghana's independence, over 30 African countries had gained their freedom. Nkrumah proved it was possible. He showed African nations that self-determination wasn't a dream, it was achievable. His influence extended beyond Africa. Civil rights leaders in America, including Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, were inspired by Nkrumah's success. The global black liberation movement saw Ghana as proof that colonialism could be defeated. Kwame Nkrumah changed history by showing that the age of empire was ending and the age of African self-determination was beginning. And now, we come to perhaps the most globally recognized African leader of all time, Nelson Mandela. Most people know Mandela's story. 27 years in prison, became president, won the Nobel Peace Prize. But the real story is so much more complex and powerful than that. South Africa under apartheid was one of the most brutally racist systems ever created. Black South Africans, who made up the majority of the population, had virtually no rights. They couldn't vote, couldn't own property in most areas, couldn't even use the same beaches or bathrooms as white people. And this was an ancient history. This was happening into the 1990s. Mandela started as a lawyer and activist. He helped form the military wing of the African National Congress because peaceful protests were being met with violence. He was labeled a terrorist by the South African government and by many Western nations, including the United States. In 1964, he was sentenced to life in prison. He could have been released earlier if he'd renounced violence, but he refused. He wouldn't compromise on freedom. For 27 years, he was in prison. Imagine that. 27 years. Most of it in a tiny cell on Robben Island, doing hard labor in a limestone quarry. He had every reason to be bitter, to be angry, to want revenge. But here's where Mandela became truly revolutionary, not just as a freedom fighter, but as a leader. When he was released in 1990, South Africa was on the brink of civil war. There was immense anger, violence, and calls for revenge against the white minority government. Mandela chose a different path. He negotiated. He talked about reconciliation instead of retribution. He convinced black South Africans to give up armed struggle, and he convinced white South Africans that they had a future in a democratic South Africa. In 1994, in South Africa's first truly democratic elections, Nelson Mandela became president. But here's what makes him a leader who changed history. He established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which allowed people who committed crimes under apartheid to confess and seek amnesty. It was controversial, but it helped South Africa avoid a bloodbath. He embraced symbols of white South Africa, like the Springboks rugby team, and made them symbols of a united nation. He understood that you can't build a country on hatred. Nelson Mandela showed the world something profound, that even after the worst injustices, reconciliation is possible. That leadership isn't about revenge. It's about building a future where everyone can thrive. When he died in 2013, the entire world mourned. Presidents, kings, and ordinary people from every continent recognized that they'd lost not just a leader, but a moral compass. His legacy isn't just about ending apartheid. It's about showing humanity a better way forward. So there you have it. 4 African leaders from 4 different eras who each changed the course of history in their own way. Mansa Musa showed that African wealth and learning were unmatched. Queen Nzinga proved that resistance to colonization was possible. Kwame Nkrumah demonstrated that independence could be won. And Nelson Mandela taught us that reconciliation can triumph over revenge. But here's the thing, these are just 4 stories. There are so many more. There's Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, who inspired the Rastafarian movement and stood up to fascist Italy. Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, who promoted African socialism and education. Patrice Lumumba, who was assassinated for daring to demand real independence for Congo. Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary who vaccinated millions and fought corruption before being murdered. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Africa's first elected female head of state. The narrative that Africa has no history, no great leaders, no civilization, it's not just wrong. It's a deliberate erasure, and it continues today. Africa is home to some of the world's fastest-growing economies, incredible innovation, and young leaders who are reshaping the continent and the world. So why does this matter? Because history shapes how we see ourselves and how we see others. When African history is erased or diminished, it affects how African people are seen globally. It affects opportunities. It affects respect. It affects justice. But when we learn the truth, when we see the brilliance, courage, and innovation of African leaders throughout history, it changes everything. So here's my challenge to you. Don't stop here. Keep learning. Read books by African historians. Follow African journalists and creators. Visit African museums if you can. And most importantly, question the narratives you've been taught. Drop a comment below and let me know which of these leaders inspired you most. Or tell me about another African leader whose story deserves to be told. Let's keep this conversation going. If you learned something new today, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into history. And share this video because these stories deserve to be heard. Remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding where we came from so we can build a better future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.